Hi, and welcome to Different Leaf, a show for new and experienced cannabis consumers. I'm Brit Smith. This episode, we're going to talk about experience-specific highs by looking at a new collaboration between the world of weed and the world of sci-fi, fantasy, and horror. If you're into comics, fantasy graphic novels, or rock music, according to recent research, chances are you're also very much into weed. That's probably because cannabis, comic books, and loud, intense music are all places where we can go to escape, to rebel and feel free. And certain strains can really amplify the way we experience art, stories, and songs. One of the most iconic names in the fantasy comic book genre is heavy metal. It started out as an adult magazine back in the 70s and has since grown into an entire heavy metal universe of comics, graphic novels, books, and one super iconic movie from the 80s.
Columbia Pictures takes you beyond the future to a universe you've never seen before.
This year, heavy metal has gotten into the legal cannabis industry. They're pairing heavy metal comics, books, and collectible cards with experience-focused cannabis grown by Berkshire Roots in Western Massachusetts. Which makes total sense because this is very obviously a stoner movie.
I think you're going a little high, man.
It's okay, man. If there's one thing I know, it's how to drive when I'm stoned.
Of course, if you're a lover of sci-fi comics, horror movies, or rock music, there are different experiences that you might want to try for each. Like sitting alone and deeply looking at art versus going to a convention or concert require different kinds of highs. So heavy metal has been working with Berkshire Roots to help cannabis consumers who love the heavy metal world find their best bud for each occasion. Our guest today is Tommy Coriale, president and head of studio at Heavy Metal. We're going to chat about how weed enhances our connection with mind-bending experimental art, how pairing movies, music, and marijuana can help with our stress relief, and what heavy metal has in store with augmented reality characters for people who smoke their weed. We'll be right back to chat with Heavy Metal Studio president Tommy Coriale.
Heavy metal. A step beyond science fiction.
For those who don't know, let's talk about what heavy metal is as a brand first. So I am told by some good friends of mine that it is the coolest old sci-fi horror fantasy brand in general. Like, you guys have the books and the graphic novels. Like, how do you describe what heavy metal is?
It's an institution, really, in science fiction, fantasy, and horror. So heavy metal was born out of Europe. Our founders, four artists who created a magazine in Europe first that was called Metal Hurlant, which translates to screaming metal, actually. And it was at a time in the world where comic books and graphic novels were really starting to become more popular than ever. But at the same time, they were censored, and censored not just in violence and sexuality, but even just in the types of stories you could tell. So these four French artists took it upon themselves to create a publication where artists could be artists and not be censored. And it caught the eye of National Lampoon, which was a big publisher here in the United States. And in the late 70s, Heavy Metal magazine was launched here in the States. And it immediately became the kind of Bible of science fiction, fantasy, and horror. From there was born the 1981 feature film that was an animated feature film that was a co-production between Heavy Metal and the late Ivan Greibman. And that really changed how people looked at the types of storytelling you could do in animation. It was really the kind of the first adult animated feature. And it also was using new technologies at the time. And from there, the brand really became the inspiration for science fiction, fantasy, and to an extent horror storytelling that we see today. All of the great filmmakers of today, George Lucas, Ridley Scott, Jon Favreau, they can all draw a straight line back to heavy metal as being kind of the single greatest either inspiration to them or inflection point in the industry. And I feel very lucky that I'm now being able to be part of that historic legacy.
Yeah, that's so, so cool. Oh my God. Okay, so it's really taken off from like it started in the late 70s, is that right? 1977?
Yep.
And it was so focused on the art and the stories and graphic novels, and it's become like series and books. But it's all got this very adult entertainment
Right.
sort of skew to it. So obviously it crosses over perfectly with cannabis. Like,
Duh, exactly.
yeah. And then along with the heavy metal film, there's that soundtrack that I know.
Iconic, yeah.
Yeah, goes down in history. So when it comes to this crossover between heavy metal and cannabis, when I first saw that there was a crossover going on, that you guys were getting into the cannabis game, I was like, ooh, that is a cool little niche audience that I can really dig into. I think that would be amazing to be high and to be watching sort of sexy sci-fi fantasy movies. Yes, I can get into that. Yeah. So your fan base at heavy metal, I don't know if you know this, but are people stoners predominantly? I mean, a lot of folks are.
Yes. So when I first joined a few years back, we had a partner that actually did some data and analytics and stuff for us. And they used primarily actually through our social media following. They were able to determine that the average heavy metal fan is 5 times more likely to be a cannabis user. And I think right around that 6 or 7 times more likely to consume alcohol. And so we knew right away, it was a validation that we saw coming. So it wasn't something we were super surprised about as a fan and, somebody who's enjoyed cannabis their whole life. That has always been me. And just like you said, it's my favorite way to watch science fiction and fantasy films. But yeah, so we knew that it was something that our fan base, young and old too, we've got a big range of fan base from early 20s to the people in their early 60s that were fans, back in the 70s and 80s. So, and across that, anecdotally, just from the stores that we've been in since our launch in April, a lot of recognition of the brand from our fans when they walk in the stores, like, holy shit, heavy metal's in cannabis now? Are you kidding me? And especially when they see with what we're doing, with the packaging and the art and all of that stuff and how we're integrating everything together. It's something our fans have so far been really supportive of and really excited about.
Yeah, so that's something that I definitely want to get into is the crossover of the art and how you're using the art alongside the cannabis. But first, let's talk about the folks that are both reading your novels and your books and taking in your content and now looking to cross over with strains of cannabis. Are there certain strains that go with certain themes of what you're reading? Do you think it can get that deep?
I think it can, and I think it will evolve to that. I think one of the things that is important to us as we use Massachusetts as our launch pad here and then learn from it and think about how we want to expand then nationally from here, because we are going to be growing into a national brand. And part of the exploration process is getting to know the strains that working with our cultivator and our manufacturer and getting the feedback from the community of the experience, right?
Right.
And then also how that ties into the experience with edibles and with concentrates and et cetera. From there, what our goal is to try and find the kind of most mind-bendingly potent, strains, and then be able to articulate what type of experiences one might enjoy with it, and then continue to create products that support that. And that's both cannabis products and the products that'll eventually go along with them in the greater heavy metal universe.
Wow. Okay, cool. So I think it's possible that fantasy and cannabis are like the perfect partners here.
Sure feels like it.
Right? Because, when you get stoned and maybe you're reading a story, maybe you're watching a film. I like to listen to podcasts, obviously. But I think that cannabis really allows you to delve into that story and to let go of, your preconceived ideas of things. And fantasy, especially, just to dive right into that. I can imagine that being stoned and, trying to get lost in the story and the characters. It's a really nice experience. And obviously the comic book thing is it's a massive deal. I've never been to Comic-Con, but I understand that this entire world is very much into fantasy. Folks dress up, and I can just see the crossover with cannabis. The communities have, a diagram like that.
100%. There's a lot of overlap. If and when you do get a chance to go to Comic-Con, just stand outside the doors and you'll smell the overlap. It's very, very prevalent there for sure. On behalf of heavy metal, it's been interesting being on this side of it versus being a fan and going to the Comic-Cons. But, just through the lens of heavy metal, we've been around for 40 something years, right? So we've got some really dedicated fans who have a real deep respect for some of our older characters, and being there and having folks show up dressed as Tarna, like our kind of flagship character, was one of the cooler experiences for me. And just seeing, like, to your point, the fun, the way in which it's an escape, right?
Yeah.
That people have, and they've turned it into, really, really thriving communities. And again, the heavy metal one is one of those, and it's growing. And I'm so happy with the fact that we can now also use the cannabis community as a place to grow the heavy metal community, because I feel like folks that are not aware yet of our comics and of our stories, this is the right audience for it. And so the more we can also expose the brand to new fans, the better. And this seems like, again, another one of those perfect Venn diagram matches.
Yeah, definitely. I've got some good friends of mine that really took me through the maze of metal when I was a teenager. It really wasn't my scene at first. I was like a 16-year-old who was into jazz music, but that was cool in its own way.
Yeah, exactly.
But two of my very best friends, they were really into metal. They would take me to like Metallica gigs. One that I really did get into back in the day was Queens of the Stone Age.
Oh, hell yeah.
Yeah, they took me to Deftones concerts. And these were some of the places where I tried weed for the first time in a social situation. Like I was passing around a joint in a crowd, and then we were moshing together. And I remember not really feeling any pain and being like, this is amazing. So I definitely can imagine that, like, I would like to take some certain strains and take them and actually like be at live concerts. And
one quick side note about the Queens of the Stone Age.
Yeah.
One of the band members of Queens of the Stone Age, and I can't say his name, is a very big fan, and we have been very quietly working on a very cool story with him. So very, very, very excited about that.
You can just give me a thumbs up or thumbs down. Is it Josh Homme?
No, I can't. First of all, I can't tell that.
But I love him.
But there's a natural overlap, obviously, with the heavy metal community. And I think some of it's obvious and some of it isn't. I think, again, part of the reason, the translation, like I had mentioned, of Metal Hurlant, right, was screaming metal. And the reason why the folks at Lampoon didn't go with that and they went with the name heavy metal, there was two parts to it. Number one was heavy metal music at the time was really starting to gain popularity, but it was more about the like rebelliousness and the DNA and the culture of it than it was about necessarily about the edginess and the hard aspect of it. And then the word heavy also, I think, in their minds translated to like just heavier topics, right? And headier topics.
Yeah.
And so I think through time, music has kind of continued to be a major influence and always have a tie-in to the brand. Heavy metal is, how you said, the natural one, and we own the name heavy metal. But what I'm finding is that today's younger heavy metal magazine fan, they're not as heavily skewing towards heavy metal music as I thought. It was that part I found really interesting. And I think because other types of music, even just hip hop and alternative rock, they have that same kind of rebellious F the man type attitude. And, there's been so much evolution of music where different types have been kind of melded together and mushed together, and out comes something brand new. Even Queens of the Stone Age is kind of a very unique, cool band that was two different sounds coming together, right? And creating kind of a new super band, right? So it's been fun to start be a historian. I wouldn't call myself a historian, but now just being at this brand, kind of looking back over time and having folks tell me, here's why this music actually speaks more to me and why this is more on brand with heavy metal. And it's been fun. Music, though, will always, I think, kind of go hand in hand. Storytelling, music, cannabis, those are three things that are always fun and always go well together, because it's a way to expand your mind and to tap into parts of it that are there, but are a little bit hard to reach sometimes.
Yeah, absolutely. And the other thing I think fits in really well with this whole world is the art. Like the art in Heavy Metal magazine is beautiful. It's gorgeous. And also the stories are cool. Is this art from certain artists that you work with? Is this fan art? How does it work?
So it's a big combination of stuff. I would say predominantly it comes from artists who are, sought out by heavy metal, and they are, the best kind of in the brightest, right, around the world. It's a very eclectic global group of artists. And then there's also the sector of artists that have been, that are kind of huge and have made their names already, but doing a heavy metal cover is like a bucket list item for them, because of the fact that it has just been so much at the forefront of the brand for so long. Heavy metal started as a magazine. Interestingly enough, I don't want to go off on too much of a tangent, but the reason why it's a magazine is because at the time when it launched in the States, there was something called the Comics Code that you could only do either G or PG comic books and graphic novels. So the idea was, well, if we make it a magazine, we can sell it on newsstands and we can sell it and we can put nudity in there, we can put swearing, even though it's technically comics, it's actually a magazine, and so it goes around the Comics Code. And because of the fact that mind bending and experimental art was always going to be part of the comics, they had the idea to say, all right, let's really focus on that for the cover also. Let's do